I would be bringing my wife and children back to the UK at this point, and the things that they're going to miss is, well, everything.
When palace walls began whispering louder than ever, even seasoned royals were caught off guard.
Charles said he hoped his experience may give encouragement to others.
Behind closed doors, Prince William and Harry reportedly found themselves united by desperation.
And I felt, you're losing people every single time you have those headlines. We all get that there's a really big urgent message.
Pleading for help as a legal storm erupted at the very heart of the monarchy. King Charles, once the symbol of calm continuity, is now said to be taking Camilla to court over explosive betrayal claims.
She becomes my queen consort.
So, what chain of events pushed this family to the brink? And could this lawsuit permanently fracture the crown beyond repair forever? A rift exposed by a single decision. The news reached the two brothers almost at the same time, though they received it in very different worlds. Within the walls of the palace, Prince William was informed through carefully chosen words and guarded expressions. Far away, Prince Harry learned of it through quieter channels, stripped of ceremony, but heavy with consequence. King Charles had authorized a sealed legal action against Camilla, and both sons understood immediately that this was not a gesture, nor a warning meant to fade with a few reassurances. It was final in intent and dangerous in implication. For William, the weight of the decision settled in quickly. He knew what a move like this meant inside the monarchy. Legal action, especially one kept behind closed doors, signaled that internal controls had failed. It meant lines had been crossed deeply enough to justify formal intervention. Standing at the center of the institution, William felt the shock ripple outward, from advisors who suddenly spoke more cautiously, from officials who avoided eye contact, from routines that no longer felt stable. His thoughts raced not toward family conflict, but toward the crown itself. What would this do to public trust?
Put together, it means ensuring the brightest and boldest amongst us, in all sectors of society.
To succession, to the fragile balance that kept the monarchy standing? Harry's reaction was shaped by distance, but no less intense. From where he stood, the news felt disturbingly familiar. He recognized the pattern instantly. Problems ignored for too long, difficult conversations delayed, and then an abrupt, dramatic response when silence could no longer hold. To him, the lawsuit confirmed what he had believed for years, that unresolved issues inside the family had been allowed to harden into something far more destructive. The difference now was scale. This was not a private fracture. It was a conflict that could reshape everything connected to their father's reign. Neither brother needed further explanation to grasp what was unfolding. A king does not move against his own queen lightly. Such an action suggested betrayal serious enough to override loyalty, tradition, and personal cost. For William, it was a crisis demanding containment. For Harry, it was proof that the system they grew up in had once again failed to protect itself and its people. Their pleas for help began in that moment, though they took very different forms. William turned inward, seeking counsel from those still operating within the palace structure. He needed guidance on how to prevent collapse, how to steady an institution suddenly thrown off balance. His concern was urgent but controlled, driven by duty and an awareness that every misstep would be magnified. Harry's plea was quieter, shaped by distance and disillusionment. He reached out selectively, not to repair the institution, but to understand how deep the damage ran. His urgency came from fear, not for protocol or perception, but for what this conflict revealed about a family that never truly healed its wounds. Though separated by geography and outlook, both brothers found themselves confronting the same truth. Their father's decision had placed them on the edge of a crisis they did not choose. The lawsuit was no longer just a matter between King Charles and Camilla. It had become a test of inheritance, identity, and trust. And as the shock settled in, One thing became clear to both sons: whatever came next would demand more than silence, and far more than loyalty alone. So what happens when inheritance becomes a weapon, and brothers must choose sides before a family secret shatters everything forever? Stay with us. Inheritance under siege. As the reality of the sealed action settled in, its meaning sharpened for both heirs in ways no briefing could soften. This was not simply a dispute between a king and his queen. It was a decision that reached forward, into succession, into legacy, into the fragile contract between the crown and the public. For Prince William, the implications were immediate and structural. For Prince Harry, they were familiar and foreboding. Different vantage points, same conclusion. The future had been pulled into a conflict neither of them created. William felt the pressure first within the machinery of the institution. Conversations that once flowed with routine certainty became cautious, hedged, and procedural. He sought internal counsel, not to challenge his father's authority, but to understand the limits of the damage. How would this action be interpreted if it surfaced? What safeguards existed to protect continuity? Advisors spoke of containment, of measured responses, of preserving legitimacy, while the process unfolded behind closed doors. Yet even in those reassurances, William heard the risk. A lawsuit of this nature, sealed or not, signaled that trust had broken at the highest level. And trust, once cracked, is difficult to restore. Harry approached the crisis from another angle entirely. Removed from palace corridors, he relied on trusted intermediaries, people who understood both the institution and the cost of its silence. His messages carried a warning more than a request. He spoke of patterns that had gone uncorrected, of moments when difficult truths were postponed until they hardened into consequences. To him, the lawsuit wasn't a sudden rupture. It was the inevitable result of choices made years earlier. The difference now was that the fallout would not be contained within private rooms. It would touch inheritance, reshape narratives, and invite public judgment. Both brothers, in their own ways, began to plead for help. Not publicly, not together. William's plea was pragmatic and inward-looking, an appeal for guidance on how to steady the institution without exposing it to further harm. He understood that succession depended not only on lineage but on legitimacy maintained through calm, credible leadership. If the crown appeared divided, the cost would be measured not in headlines, but in confidence lost. Harry's plea carried a different urgency. He reached out to caution against repeating mistakes, urging acknowledgement rather than management. To him, containment without accountability was the very cycle that had led them here. His concern was not how the monarchy would look tomorrow, but whether it could withstand another fracture built on avoidance. What bound their responses together was the realization that the lawsuit had redefined their roles. They were no longer observers or heirs in waiting. They were stakeholders in a reckoning that would shape how the monarchy was perceived and whether it could still claim moral authority. Succession now came with conditions. Legacy carried questions. Public legitimacy, once assumed, now required defense. As the days unfolded, the brothers sensed the pull tightening. Advisors expected alignment. Silence was interpreted as consent. Every move, or lack of one, took on meaning. The conflict pressed inward, demanding choices neither had anticipated making so soon. And while their approaches diverged, the shared truth remained. A legal action meant to draw boundaries had instead exposed fault lines, placing the future of the crown under scrutiny from the very heirs expected to protect it. And now, as silence hardens into judgment, do the brothers defend the crown or expose the words written in ink? Keep watching. Words written in doubt, preserved in ink. As pressure mounted around the sealed action, a quieter truth began to surface. one that explained why King Charles had chosen such a drastic path. Long before legal steps were authorized and advisors mobilized, the king had entered a period of deep reflection. It was during this time, away from public appearances and ceremonial routine, that he put his concerns to paper. The result was a handwritten letter, composed deliberately and without an audience, intended not as an accusation, but as a record. Those who later encountered the letter described its tone as restrained, almost somber. There was no anger in the language, no attempt to dramatize events. Instead, it read like a careful inventory of unease. King Charles wrote of patterns that troubled him, decisions taken without proper consultation, channels of influence operating beyond agreed boundaries, and a growing sense that authority within the household was being reshaped without his consent. What made the document so implicating was its specificity. Dates were noted, meetings were referenced, phrases were underlined where assurances had been given, then quietly contradicted by later actions. One passage in particular stood out. In it, the king acknowledged his fear that plans were being laid for a future beyond his reign without his approval. He wrote of preparations made in my name, but not with my knowledge, and questioned how such maneuvering could occur unless trust had already been compromised. Another section addressed influence, how access, once granted for support, had expanded into authority exercised independently. The words were measured, but the meaning was unmistakable. This was not confusion, it was recognition. The letter did more than explain the lawsuit, it justified it. It established the cause. It showed that the legal action was not born of sudden conflict, but of concerns documented over time and left unresolved. When the decision was finally made to move forward, the letter became the moral and legal foundation beneath it. Prince William encountered the letter as a responsibility. Reading his father's words, he felt the weight of continuity settle heavily on his shoulders. The document made clear that this was not about personal grievances, but about safeguarding the institution from unchecked drift. To William, the letter demanded action, not emotion, not distance, but stewardship. It framed the lawsuit as an act of preservation, however painful. For Prince Harry, the same words carried a different impact. He read the letter as confirmation of what he had long believed, that warnings had been raised quietly and set aside until they could no longer be ignored. The king's careful documentation revealed a pattern Harry recognized too well. Problems acknowledged in private, avoided in practice, and confronted only when they became unavoidable. To him, the letter was less a call to duty and more an indictment of delay. What neither brother could ignore was the letter's role as evidence. It was not speculation or hindsight. It was a contemporaneous account written by the king himself, outlining the very behaviors now under scrutiny. Its existence altered the narrative entirely. The lawsuit was no longer a shocking rupture. It was the final step in a process that had begun months earlier with pen and paper. As excerpts from the letter were quietly introduced into internal discussions, their effect was immediate. Conversations changed tone. Assumptions were challenged. The question shifted from whether the king had overreached to why his concerns had been allowed to deepen for so long. And with that shift came a realization shared by both sons. The true center of the conflict was no longer the action itself, but the truths the letter had preserved. Truths too implicating and too deliberate to be dismissed. But what did the letter reveal that froze William, shattered Harry, and turned Camilla from accused into potential architect overnight? Stay glued. Power interpreted, trust divided. By the time the letter's contents began to shape internal discussions, attention inevitably turned to the figure at the center of it all. Camilla's rise within the royal structure had not been sudden, nor had it been accidental. It followed a clear pattern, one built on access carefully gained, influence gradually expanded, and authority quietly consolidated. The facts themselves were not in dispute. What divided the family, and especially the two brothers, was what those facts meant. From Prince William's position inside the institution, Camilla's actions appeared increasingly misaligned with the balance the monarchy depended on. Her access to advisors widened over time, often bypassing established channels. Meetings once considered informal became routine. Decisions that traditionally required broader consultation were shaped earlier, behind closed doors, before formal processes even began. To William, this was not ambition for its own sake, but a structural concern. The monarchy survived on clear boundaries between influence and authority, between support and control. When those lines blurred, the entire system weakened. He did not see Camilla as reckless or careless. On the contrary, what troubled him most was how precise her movements appeared. Each step was defensible on its own. Each expansion of role came with justification. But, taken together, they formed a pattern that shifted power away from collective governance and toward personal direction. In William's eyes, this was where institutional balance tipped into risk. Prince Harry interpreted the same actions through a far more personal lens. To him, Camilla's rise was inseparable from the family's unresolved past. He viewed her growing influence not as a threat to structure, but as a reminder of compromises made and consequences delayed. The quiet consolidation of authority echoed older wounds, times when concerns were voiced, dismissed, and later proven valid. What William analyzed as institutional drift, Harry experienced as emotional continuity. The betrayal, in his mind, was not merely procedural, it was deeply human. Yet both brothers were responding to the same documented reality. The letter had already outlined concerns about unauthorized influence and preparations made without consent. It referenced decisions that had taken shape outside agreed frameworks and authority exercised in anticipation of a future not yet sanctioned. Camilla's confidence, once viewed as strength, now appeared to some as overreach, not because of intent, but because of impact. What made this moment especially tense was the absence of clear villainy. There were no reckless statements, no public confrontations, no obvious breach that could be pointed to and dismissed. Instead, there was accumulation, influence layered upon influence, access compounding into expectation, and within that slow build, trust eroded almost invisibly. William struggled with the implications of confronting this reality. To challenge Camilla's role was to risk destabilizing the very institution he was meant to protect. Harry, less bound by internal consequence, struggled with a different fear that once again uncomfortable truths would be softened in the name of unity. The same actions, seen through different histories, produced different alarms. One brother saw a system slipping out of alignment. The other saw history repeating itself with new faces and familiar silence. And as both interpretations gained quiet support within different circles, it became clear that the conflict was no longer just about what Camilla had done, but about what the monarchy had allowed to happen, and how long it had been willing to look away. So how did secrets, whispers, and unspoken oaths twist loyalty into betrayal, forcing brothers to choose between blood and the crown? Silence, where brotherhood once lived. As the conflict tightened its grip, something quieter, but far more permanent, began to take shape between the brothers. Communication, once careful but present, thinned into formality and then faded altogether. It was not marked by a final argument or a dramatic break. Instead, it happened through pauses left unanswered and calls never returned. The lawsuit had not only divided the institution, it had exposed a fracture that neither William nor Harry knew how to cross anymore. For Prince William, the weight of duty grew heavier with each passing day. The crown, already under strain, now faced a threat that could not be managed through tradition alone. He felt bound to stabilize what his father had built, even if it meant absorbing criticism and restraint in silence. To William, protecting the monarchy meant limiting damage, narrowing the circle of trust, and ensuring that whatever truth emerged did so without causing collapse. His plea for help was directed toward repair, quietly reinforcing foundations before they cracked beyond recovery. Harry could not accept that approach. To him, containment looked too much like the patterns that had led them here in the first place. He saw restraint as avoidance and patience as another form of denial. Where William believed the crown could still be protected through careful action, Harry believed the cost of that protection had already been paid too many times. His plea for help was not about preserving structure, but about freeing himself from it. Escape, not repair, felt like the only honest response left. This divergence reshaped how each brother viewed the other. William saw Harry's refusal to engage as abandonment at a moment when unity mattered most. Harry saw William's willingness to stay as complicity in a system that demanded silence in exchange for survival. Neither accusation was spoken aloud, but both lingered heavily in the space between them. What made the rupture especially painful was their shared understanding of what was at stake. Both recognized the seriousness of their father's actions. Both understood the implications of the letter, the influence it exposed, and the damage already done. Yet they stood on opposite sides of how to respond. One leaned toward preservation, even at personal cost. The other leaned toward distance, believing that remaining involved would only deepen the harm. Trusted intermediaries noticed the change. Messages once passed carefully between the brothers now stalled. Updates were shared through advisors instead of directly. Decisions were made without consultation. The silence became its own statement, one that spoke of exhaustion, disappointment, and a shared history now too heavy to carry together. The family conflict had evolved into something generational. It was no longer just about a lawsuit or questions of influence. It was about inheritance of responsibility, of pain, of unresolved truths. William inherited the burden of holding everything together. Harry inherited the certainty that holding on came at too great a cost. As the institution prepared for what might come next, the brothers stood apart, each convinced that his path was the only one that could be lived with. And in that distance, the monarchy's deepest challenge revealed itself, not in courts or sealed documents, but in the quiet realization that the next generation no longer spoke with one voice and might never again. Now, what could force William and Harry to confront secrets even the crown feared? Are alliances breaking, or is betrayal already in motion? Stay tuned. A throne, tested by duty and desire. The weight of consequence pressed heavily on Charles as he sat in the quiet of his study, the walls lined with memories and the faint scent of polished wood mingling with the tension in the air. The lawsuit he had filed was meant to secure order, to assert the authority he believed necessary to protect his family's legacy. But the very act that promised stability had begun to fracture the bonds he held most dear. He had thought the law would serve as a shield, yet it had become a mirror, reflecting the rift he could no longer ignore. Each step he took in the legal arena seemed to anchor one crisis while simultaneously igniting another. By asserting his position, he had quelled the immediate threats to the family's fortune and reputation. Yet, the victory was hollow. Charles found himself increasingly distant from his sons, their trust and affection slipping through his fingers like sand. Authority demanded firmness, but it exacted a price that no judgment could quantify. The halls he once walked with, warmth now echoed with absence and restraint. His advisors, ever pragmatic and careful, offered warnings that cut through the fog of legal strategy. Without unity, one had said, inheritance is hollow. Power without loyalty is fragile. Their words lingered, a chilling reminder that a family once fractured might resist any attempt to bind it together again. Charles understood the truth behind their caution. The law could dictate terms, enforce compliance, and even redistribute assets, but it could not command hearts. That realization settled over him like a winter dusk, cold and unyielding. Charles began to trace the timeline of his actions, reflecting on how each decision, each demand for order had reshaped the family landscape. What was meant as protection now felt like punishment, not only for those who defied him but for the sons who had once sought his guidance without fear. Every memorandum signed, every counsel heard, every quiet negotiation had its echo, and that echo reverberated in moments of private solitude when regret whispered more loudly than reason. The inner conflict was relentless. He recognized the necessity of structure, the inevitability of accountability, yet the deeper human cost gnawed at him. Law and blood, order and love, authority and intimacy, they were no longer compatible in the way he had once believed. Charles could assert power, yes, but each assertion widened the emotional chasm. Every attempt to maintain control reminded him that control alone could never heal the fractures his actions had exposed. In the stillness, he understood that this chapter of his life was no longer about victory or defense. It was about reckoning. The legal battle had stabilized what could be stabilized, but it had unveiled a fragility that no decree could mend. As he looked toward the uncertain days ahead, Charles felt the gravity of a throne weighed down not just by obligation, but by the quiet, unyielding pull of the hearts he could no longer fully reach. But could a single secret, hidden for decades, shatter the monarchy entirely and force even kings to choose between family and power? A crown tested by the next generation. The palace had grown quieter in the days that followed Charles's legal maneuvers, yet beneath the calm, tension simmered like a storm held just behind the horizon. The battles had shifted. No longer were the disputes about Camilla alone, no longer confined to personal grievances or scandal. Now, the very foundation of the monarchy, its ability to endure, to command respect, and to unify, was under scrutiny. The heirs themselves, once symbols of continuity and loyalty, had become arbiters of judgment, and their divided voices carried weight far beyond any courtroom or council chamber. William and Harry, once inseparable in childhood innocence, now stood on opposite sides of a fault line that seemed to grow with every public statement, every carefully observed gesture. Their pleas, their arguments, the expressions of loyalty tinged with reproach became more than familial discourse. They were a verdict. Through private letters, carefully choreographed appearances, and rare interviews, the brothers revealed not only their personal frustrations, but a profound questioning of the institution itself. Every request for fairness, every insistence on transparency was laden with implication. If the heirs themselves could not trust the system that would crown them, what hope remained for those who watched from afar? The palace walls, once resilient and insulated, now seemed porous. Courtiers whispered, journalists probed, and loyalists debated quietly among themselves. The monarchy, for all its centuries of ritual and ceremony, faced a trial unlike any in its history, not of law, but of perception, of confidence, and of generational faith. Charles had acted to assert order, to stabilize crises and protect what he could, yet the unintended consequence was clear. Authority, however legally sanctioned, could not mend the emotional rift widening across the family. And as the princes wrestled with their own roles and rights, the institution they were meant to inherit seemed increasingly vulnerable, its strength judged not by tradition, but by trust, or the lack of it. Each public appearance, each private meeting, became a test of endurance. The eyes of the world watched as William spoke with measured caution, attempting to balance filial duty with moral expectation, while Harry's tone, more urgent and questioning, exposed the fissures beneath the ceremonial gloss. The contrast was stark, one heir embodying restraint, the other exposing raw concern. Together they illustrated a stark reality. The monarchy's legacy was no longer protected simply by lineage or law. Its survival depended on a fragile unity, and unity was a currency in short supply. As the weeks passed, Charles observed the unfolding dynamic with a mix of apprehension and resignation. The legal battles had provided clarity, yes, but clarity came at a cost. He could enforce structure, demand accountability, and even dictate terms, yet he could not control hearts or compel trust. The courtroom had yielded verdicts, but the palace, the family, and ultimately the monarchy itself faced a subtler, weightier judgment. One that measured loyalty against skepticism, respect against resentment, and duty against generational expectation. In the quiet moments of reflection, Charles understood the truth that no decree could alter. A crown judged by its heirs is a crown already tested, and tests leave their mark. The trials of law, strategy, and public perception had stabilized immediate threats, yet they had also exposed an enduring vulnerability. Each brother's divided plea was more than personal, it was symbolic. It signaled a reckoning that could not be postponed. And in this reckoning, the monarchy's fate seemed less certain, less invincible, and more human than any ceremony, title, or tradition might suggest. Even as Charles prepared for the responsibilities ahead, a sense of uneasy anticipation remained. The throne, meant to represent unity and continuity, now stood at the intersection of legacy and doubt. Its strength could no longer be measured in lineage alone. It had to be earned anew every day in the fragile spaces where trust and respect intersected. And as the heirs cast their verdict with every gesture and word, it became clear. The monarchy, judged by those it was meant to protect and empower, might already bear cracks that would take generations to repair. So, what do you think happens when a crown is judged not by law, but by the hearts of its heirs? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.